Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of Political Debrief. I'm your host, Josh Oliverio. On July 8th, Rogers, a Canadian telecom company, experienced a nationwide outage that meant its customers were unable to watch TV, use the internet, use cell data, or make a phone call, and many businesses were also taken offline, including Interac, the business that runs most of the debit card transactions in Canada, and the e-transfer system. This sparked calls from many people to reform Canada's telecom sector. And to talk about those ideas, I'm joined today by Dr. Michael Geist of the University of Ottawa. Here's our conversation. And joining me now is Dr. Michael Geist. Dr. Geist is a law professor at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Geist, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm happy to. Thanks for having me.
So, can you start off by kind of going into a little bit more detail about what you teach at the University of Ottawa?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa. I hold the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, and my focus is really, I suppose, on the intersection between law, technology, and policy. And so, given how much technology affects so many different aspects of our daily lives and the policy implications that arise from that, it becomes a pretty broad mandate. And I focus on everything from intellectual property issues like copyright, internet regulation, privacy related issues, as well as broadcast and telecommunications.
Awesome. So let's get into it. And, on July 8th, Rogers had pretty much a nationwide outage. It was about 11 hours before people even started to get service. Do you think an outage like this was preventable in any way?
That's an interesting place to start. And as you say, it took the outage lasted a long period of time for many people. It was 24 hours or more, so it was very very long. I'm of the view that outages will happen. And I think there are some that have come out of this saying, "Hey, we have to ensure this never happens again." I'm not sure that that's realistic. There are going to be outages from time to time. The question is, how do we help mitigate in circumstances where it does occur? How do we ensure that these occur as infrequently as possible? How do we ensure that we've got appropriate compensation models where we do occur? And I think in many respects, this particular outage has been a wake up call because I think it's highlighted that we don't have good compensation models, that many of us are dependent for almost all of our services on a single provider, which really increases the risks that we have. And I think is a little bit of a function of a marketplace that is not particularly competitive. And we need companies that do a better job of prioritizing some of these kinds of issues. And I think that the track record, particularly of Rogers, isn't a great one in that regard.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point about Canadians and the provider that they use for their services. I'll use Rogers as an example because it's been in the spotlight over the last little bit. Rogers has a service called Ignite, and Ignite is essentially internet and television bundled together. And if you want TV, you have to buy Ignite Internet because the Ignite TV is through the internet. And Rogers has many different. Rogers has explained why this is a good thing, or why they think it's a good thing. With the technological advancements that we've had to our telecom system or telecom services, in terms of competition and Canadians choosing different providers, do you think that's at all possible with some of the technical requirements that come with these advanced services?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I think there's two elements there. One of them is the shift amongst providers towards what would be known as IP-based services. That almost everything are now services that run on the internet, and so that includes what used to be a hardline cable service is now more of an internet-based service. Phone line tends to be an internet service, and of course, internet is an internet service. So many of our services are now internet-based. They offer a certain amount of convenience. They offer cost benefits, certainly for the providers themselves. And in a competitive environment, some of those cost benefits would be passed on to consumers. I'm not sure that always happens, but nevertheless, that's at least the hope. Whether or not there's any turning back from that, I'm not sure. I think that this was a wake up call, even for some consumers who thought that, worst case scenario, when things go down, at least I'll have my phone line. And it turned out that wasn't the case. So I think this is a bit of a wake up call that we are very dependent on that network enabled communication suite of services in a way that it certainly wasn't the case even just a few years ago. That's and as I say, I'm not sure that that's going away, even though there are both advantages and disadvantages with that kind of setup. The other aspect, though, that is more unique to Canada, it's not unique, but it's more commonly found in Canada than in some other places, is the gravitation towards bundled services, where so many of us buy all of our services, and we mentioned all of them are tend to be IP based, buy so many of our services all from a single provider. So for many, their internet service, their cable service, if they've got television service, their home phone service, their wireless service, all bundled together with a single provider. Let's say it's Rogers. It would be in my case, it was Rogers. And many of them do so because, of course, there are cost benefits for doing so. It is cheaper. It is made cheaper if you take on more and more of these services, and even more, then extend it to some of your family and buy into some of these family plans. So the providers do offer economic incentives to put more and more of your service, your communication services, all with a single provider. That may offer some cost benefits, but I think as we learned during the outage, it comes also with some serious risks because when there's an outage, like there was with Rogers, everything goes down. And it would make a lot more sense for people to spread things around a little bit as a mitigation strategy against that outcome. And yet, because we don't have a particularly competitive environment, because our costs are high relative to what is found elsewhere, one of the only ways Canadian consumers often find themselves in a position to try to deal with these issues is by jumping in with the bundling.
And I think you bring up a good point, and it gives us an opportunity to talk a little bit more about competition, which I know is something that you've been talking about a lot. I'll provide an example where I live. It's not very rural, but I mean it's definitely not in the middle of the city. We only have one provider that offers high speed internet. It's one of the major two. So if we don't like that provider, our only choice is to go to a solution like a company in Ontario called Tech Savvy, which offers like they lease the line from that provider, which does bring the cost down a little bit. But I didn't have internet in I didn't we even though we are not a Rogers customer, we were down internet in on July 8th. So on that competition, Mark, is it just simple enough to say um, well, companies like TechSavvy or Comwave can rent the line. That's good enough competition. How do we improve competition in the space?
Yeah. So I think that's part of the solution is are these third party providers that use part of the line, though not all the line. TechSavvy invests in its own network as well. So if you have TechSavvy service, part of what you're getting is a Rogers line, but not exclusively so. And TechSavvy is managing their customers and their network in certain ways as well. But they have been able to find, and there's a number of these kinds of companies out there, they have been able to find cost savings that they're happy to pass along to customers. Now, many of those kinds of systems, including sort of equivalent on the wireless side, do depend on a regulator. In this case, in Canada, it's the CRTC, playing a more active role in seeking to ensure that there is this kind of competition and that there is the opportunity for some of these innovative third-party service-based providers to come to market. I don't know that the regulator nor the government have been as supportive of that as they could be. But I don't know that that's the only solution either, especially for people in rural and remote communities. At times, it may require more public investments to try to ensure that there is basic access, broadband access, because in many communities, many of them find themselves without even that kind of very basic access.
And I want to play a clip now of an exchange you had when you were testifying at the House of Commons committee a few days ago. An exchange between you and a Conservative MP. Let's play that now.
My first few questions are for Dr. Geist. We heard today how the CRTC, as the regulator of telecommunications, has not taken risk assessment or oversight seriously, unlike other regulators who do. And so, would you agree with this, and do you think that they should be?
Oh, absolutely. And Mr. Lawford, I think, just pointed to this as well. And, it was, I thought, remarkable and exceptionally discouraging to watch the chair of the CRTC kind of give a virtual shrug when posed with questions about the role that new regulations could play, about the role that penalties could play, about the role that competition could play, as if all of this is just inevitable and it's just there for the CRTC after the fact to engage in a bit of fact finding. If the regulator is to mean anything, surely it's got to do more than just that.
Well, for myself, listening to the answers from the executives at the CRTC, I felt like I was actually questioning senior telecom executives, not the regulator. And so, on that note, would you agree that the CRTC is not fulfilling their mandate as regulator and the minister is not holding the CRTC accountable?
I think you can make a compelling case on both of those fronts. There has been an enormous amount of concern and frustration about the way the CRTC has conducted itself. There have been allegations of bias with the current CRTC chair and the industry itself. So your observation about thinking that you're listening to a telecom executive can be forgiven.
So, in that question, you were asked if you believe the CRTC had fulfilled its mandate, and you said no. Can you go into detail a little bit more on that?
Yeah, it's yeah. Thank you for that question. The Canadians depend upon policy implementation both from the regulator, from the CRTC, as well as from the government. And I think we've been let down by both in this regard, particularly though from the CRTC. It was striking to me, and I did a little quiz on my website that highlighted quotes from the chair of the CRTC as well as quotes from the CEO of Rogers, Tony Staffieri, and challenged people to identify who had said what. And I have to say that hundreds of people took the quiz, and for the first, I think, 600 or more, there was not a single person who was able to come up with all the right answers for all 12 of those questions, 12 of those quotes, highlighting just how indistinguishable in many ways the regulator was from the company they were regulating. And I think that in some ways is illustrative of some of the problems that we've had. We've had a CRTC, especially in recent years, that has not prioritized consumer interest, hasn't prioritized, I don't think, even the public interest in a serious way, and instead has been seen as a regulator that by and large is very supportive of the incumbent industry. And I don't think that that's its role. I think they've been let down by the CRTC in that regard, and I think the consequences are significant, both in terms of the kinds of prices that we pay, the competitive environment, and when we see these kind of outages, the impact that can have on Canadians.
The area you focused mostly on was that angle of the CRTC and the government. The CRTC is supposed to be advocating for the best interest or doing things for the best interest of the Canadian public. That's kind of what the CRTC is to do. But another point of what they're supposed to do is ensure that 911 services are online, operational, and can be used. That wasn't the case on July 8th. And the CRTC has kind of said, okay, we're looking into it. We're going to find a better way to maybe add some redundancy. So those are the kind of the 2 points of the CRTC. What do you think there's any other um, points or any other things that the CRTC should be responsible for or that they are responsible for and or aren't doing?
Yeah, well, listen, CRTC is a very broad mandate, both in telecommunications and in broadcast, and if the government gets their way on internet-related issues as well. So it already touches on a lot of different things. With respect to telecom, I think it needs to be more active and more supportive, frankly, of a competitive environment in the best interests of the public, in particular of consumers. I think it needs to do a better job on consumer protection rights. One of the things that was striking in the aftermath of the Rogers outage was, the question arose about what kind of compensation consumers were entitled to. And Rogers started by saying, well, we think maybe a day, maybe two. Eventually, they landed on more than that. They landed on 5 days of compensation. And I think part of that stemmed from the public anger, even internal anger about their initial response. My view would be that it really ought not to be up to Rogers to decide whether it's 1 day, 2 days, or 5 days. Really, we need clear cut rules that establish what kind of compensation is available to consumers. And if there is an outage, and we can have it in the rules about how long an outage would be before it's compensable, we should have those kinds of standards in place, and it could fall to the CRTC to do that. I don't think it's done that in an effective way. Even you mentioned 911. Even on 911 emergency service, it's an area where the CRTC, if you go back years ago, was reluctant to wade in. They did not necessarily see this as an area that needed this kind of regulatory involvement. They actually eliminated, you may recall, a number of years ago, payphones, the days when you used to be able to walk around in your town and actually use a payphone. They eliminated those, even those would have provided a backup as well. I don't think they've been as attuned to these kinds of issues, including around emergency services, as they need to be. And I think in some ways the proof is the fact that so many Canadians found themselves without access with a system that was supposed to work in these circumstances that didn't. Many of them found themselves with home phone services and found that there was no backup there at all. And emergency services are one of those kinds of things that need to work always. I mean, it's just really there cannot be downtime in that regard. And the fact that the system failed is really, I think, one of the most severe and troubling outcomes from this entire episode.
And truth be told, I didn't listen to the 4.5 hours of. I didn't listen to all of the committee hearings. But from what I picked up is that on the 911 front, there was an opportunity that Rogers had around 10 a.m. Eastern on July 8th to bring 911 back online by transferring it to another network. And they didn't. They chose, instead of switching it over to a different carrier, which would have taken down the entire cell network. Um, they chose to leave it online and hope that it comes up. First of all, is that correct? Because I could be really misunderstanding this. And B, if that is correct, should it be up to Rogers to decide that?
Yeah, so I think it's worth noting there is a system that is supposed to deal with these circumstances. In fact, your cell phone is supposed to work even in circumstances where the carrier goes down. And in other words, it shouldn't matter what SIM you have. Your phone the system is supposed to function in a manner that it will look for an available system or whatever that might happen to be in order to ensure that you can connect. Now that's for wireless. That's not for, say, the home phone services that may themselves be out altogether. That system did not work as intended, though. And so part of it was technically within the system, it wasn't identifying as the system being down in such a way that it would create that transfer. The minister and the government have emphasized that they want to see those kinds of issues fixed and addressed with mandated emergency roaming and other measures that might try to assist consumers in that regard. But to me, I think the bottom line here is that system, at least on that day, didn't work as intended or as expected, and that too, I think, is viewed as a deeply troubling outcome.
And Canadians, even youth, Canadians, elderly people, everyone now relies on the internet to do banking, to look up information, to get news, to send in a prescription request or refill their prescriptions, find information on traffic to make sure that they get to work on time. All of these services, or most of those, would probably be considered essential in today's world. Do you think it's time that internet and cellular data and services be deemed a public utility and run and overseen by the government at a very closer lens?
Yeah, no, so notable question that did come up during the hearings. I guess I would say a couple of things here. First, the fact that certain services went down, I think requires some investigation, not only into what happened with Rogers, but also into what happened with those services. So for example, Interac, the widely used e-banking service that so many of us use for debit transactions, it went down because it was pretty much wholly reliant on Rogers. Now that raises its own set of issues. Why did such a critically important service engage in a service provision approach that put itself at that kind of risk? It's one thing, we were talking earlier about a consumer that does it because they're faced high bills and they're trying to find a way to gain some economic savings through bundling. why Interac would be in effect bundling or putting all their eggs in a single Rogers basket, I think is the kind of question that needs to be asked. And that's in some ways separate from the broader questions around Rogers itself and essential services. On the specific issue of essential services, my view is that I'm not sure that the government would necessarily do any better here, right? So I'm not sure if we look, for example, at how some what we've seen in some of our airports or some of the other kinds of things that government has an active involvement in. I don't know that handing this over to the government would necessarily solve all of these issues. I think that the prospect of problems there are just as likely as they are if it's wholly within the private sector. But I do think asking the question about essential services and really, to me, more fundamentally raises the question about what's the appropriate role of regulation in this space. Not necessarily do we want the government to run it, but do we want a more active government, a more active regulator in providing oversight, in regulating this sector more broadly? And to me, the answer there is unquestionably yes. It comes back to some of the questions you've asked earlier about what I see as real failures by the regulator and also by the government in establishing a policy framework that's effective. And when people start saying, well, we need to think of this as an essential service, or we need the government to come in and run this, it is really, I think, a reaction to the frustration, both about what they've experienced, but also about what they see as ongoing failures from the government and the regulator in creating competition and creating the necessary kind of oversight that we need here.
And kind of on that note, a bunch of US cities are looking into this. I know in Ontario we have a couple cities that have implemented it, but a municipal broadband is what it's called, kind of, where the government essentially sets up their own local ISP, internet service provider, and they provide it kind of like a public utility to their residents. Do you think that that is a potential solution?
I'm definitely a big fan of any number of different new sorts of competitors into the marketplace, and I think that can unquestionably include community-owned broadband and wireless networks. So yes, we have seen it. There are questions, of course, again, as always, about who is best to run some of these networks, but I think that there may well be compelling cases in communities that may be underserved or may only have a single provider that the community can come together and say, we think that there are real benefits for us to effectively create our own community run network for the benefits of our community. We need to ensure that they're able to do that where that's what the community wants to see happen. They get the on ramps that they need, the internet interconnectivity in effect with other networks. But yeah, we've seen this play out in a number of jurisdictions. And, I think that each time we see these sorts of initiatives, the communities learn. I think the broader public learns, but it's definitely the kind of experimentation that we ought to be seeing.
So, our conversation today, there have been a lot of ideas that are quite major, ideas that might take quite a little bit of time to put in place, set up competition. That's all stuff that could take a while. What are some smaller changes that we could make in the interim to make life just a little bit more affordable, a little bit more competitive, or a little bit more reliable?
Yeah, you raise a question that I think has always been one of the biggest challenges because most of the big picture reforms that would have the biggest amount of impact are the kinds of things that you don't flick a switch and the change happens overnight. It does require a long-term sustained policy initiative and it can take years to see the kind of fruition which does not line up with the typical timelines that our politicians have, let's say, who are running for election and they often want to see results fast enough that they can then point to their policy initiatives and say, "Yeah, you see, I've made life better for you." So I think that we need to be in this for the long haul, recognizing that if it's competition, for example, and an effective regulator that's here to solve some of these things that we need, that, we needed to do that yesterday. The next best option is today. And so we need to move forward in that regard. There are some things, though, in the short term that we can address. And we've talked, I think, already about a few of those already. Consumer rights is one good example. So I think having some of those stronger consumer rights is something that we could do quickly. Having better communications protocols in place to ensure that people are kept up to date about outages, with greater transparency associated with those outages, is something that we could do very quickly. And I should note that the chair of the CRTC, who I've been critical of, both generally and in our conversation here, is due to be changed. And the government is expected to name a new chair of the CRTC early in the fall in September. And that also is another example of the potential we have to put someone in that position to make a more immediate change, because the CRTC will be engaged in a lot of these different kinds of policies. There's an opportunity here to put someone in charge who does, as you were saying earlier, put the public interest at the center of the policy work and the regulatory work of the CRTC, something that I don't think we've seen for the last few years.
In 5, 7, 8 years, what things, or what should we look to see in the market to know that we are on the right path and that we have made positive change to this sector?
Well, I like thinking in that kind of time frame. I guess I'd point to two things. One, number of competitors we have in the marketplace. So, do we have more competitors in 5 years and 7 years than we have right now? Or have we seen further consolidation, further mergers like one proposed right now between Rogers and Shaw? And then fundamentally, of course, it's about output. It's about what does that actually mean for consumers? So how do we compare with what we would view as peer countries in terms of pricing for consumers? How do we compare with some of those countries in terms of the speeds that are available? Have we ensured that there is full universal affordable network availability for all Canadians, regardless of whether they live in big cities, smaller communities, or in rural and remote communities? Those are the kinds of benchmarks that I think we ought to be judging both government policy and the state of Canadian communications more broadly.
All right, Dr. Geist, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Great conversation.
And that's it for the YouTube edition of the Political Debrief podcast. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be releasing a bonus episode next Monday, September 5th, with my conversation with Dr. Geist about Bill C-11, a very controversial piece of legislation. That podcast episode will be released on the audio version of the Political Debrief podcast on your favorite podcast platform. That link will be down below if you want to subscribe, and it gives you lots of benefits like the ability to listen in the car or on your favorite smart speaker. You can connect with the show on Twitter at Josh Oliverio and on Instagram at Political Debrief Show. Those links are down below. And you can take a look at our website at politicaldebrief.com to see the rest of our episodes and learn more about Dr. Geist. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching.